Yeah, you got it, Stu. Make mine a double. Oh, hello there. Welcome back to Scott Goes Pop. My name is James Kelly. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about Stu because he has been disparaging Believe in Scotland's newly published plan for independence, and he's been accusing them of only putting it forward in the way they have because they're grifting. And this is a pretty common refrain from Stuart. Pretty much everybody apart from himself is grifting, even though he fundraises just like the rest of us. And the thing is, I mean, all of us who do fundraise, we put ourselves in the position where we can be accused of grifting, but Stuart is unique in two respects. Firstly, because he chucked tens of thousands of pounds of crowd-funded money away on a completely pointless vanity court case against Kezia Dugdale, which he lost comprehensively, spectacularly, decisively lost that court case, and that money just disappeared down the drain, never to return. I think anybody else has used crowd-funded money quite as irresponsibly as that. You can criticize other people's fundraising campaigns and what they've done with the money, but there's been nothing quite on that scale that I'm aware of. And the other thing about Stuart is that he's the only person I can think of who takes money away from independent supporters to fund his campaigning against independence. All the rest of us, I mean, whatever you might think about our strategies or our beliefs or whatever, we do actually try and bring independence closer, whereas Stuart tries to push it away by urging his readers to vote for unionist parties. It looks like he's going to back Reform UK at the election in May. He says himself he would probably abstain if he got a vote in a new independence referendum. He is no longer an independent supporter, and yet he somehow gets money from independent supporters to campaign against independence. It is absolutely extraordinary that he has the brass neck to accuse anybody else of grifting. And in particular, he accuses me of only saying that uh, I'm going to vote both votes SNP because it would harm my income. In other words, I mean, what should really worry him is actually, I don't think that way. He obviously does. This is the first thing that comes into his head about other people. So obviously he does think this way. But it wouldn't even occur to me to let such an important matter as how I vote on this country's future be determined by, a few pennies or a few pounds here and there. It's just completely absurd. And what should really scare him is the fact that I'm voting both votes SNP because of the way the voting system works. And there's watertight logic for doing that because of the way the voting system works, which he himself recognized in 2016 when he said, just like I did, that voting tactically on the list is a mug's game. Now, there's the saying, when the facts change, sir, I change my mind. What do you do? Well, what does Stu do when the facts don't change? What does Stu do when the electoral system works in exactly the same way as it did in 2016 when he said that tactical voting on the list doesn't work? When the facts don't change, Stu changes his mind. Does that have something to do with drifting? Perhaps it does, but only he can answer that. I'm content to say that my view has remained consistent because the voting system has not changed. The facts have not changed. My views remain consistent. So the justification for accusing me of grifting certainly is not there. As for Stuart, probably a different matter. But anyway, well, let's get back to this Stuart's critique, if we can call it that, of the Believe in Scotland plan for independence. I'll be totally honest with you. When I first heard about this plan and I saw in vague terms what it was suggesting, I was skeptical about it, and I expected to be skeptical about it. And as you may know, if you've been reading the blog over the last couple of years, I have had my own disagreements with Believe in Scotland. In fact, Gordon McIntyre Kemp got really quite angry with me at one point, unjustifiably angry, let me add. But nevertheless, um, having looked at the plan, to my surprise, I am actually really encouraged by it. I think it's a very positive contribution. A lot of the criticisms that have been made of it, I think, are actually based on a misunderstanding of what the plan says. And in particular, there's this idea that Believe in Scotland, having just entered into this agreement with the SNP, it's quite an unprecedented agreement. It's odd for them to then say that the SNP's plan for winning independence at next year's Holyrood election won't work. And that would be odd if that's what they were saying, but actually having read the plan, I realised that is not actually the case. What they're really saying, believe in Scotland, is that it's no longer possible for next year's Holyrood election to be a de facto referendum. That's my understanding of it. And they're saying that I think the reason for the misunderstanding, so using quite odd language, are saying that the reason it's not possible is because the SNP are not ready, whereas in fact the real reason is because the SNP have set their face against the idea. Uh, John Swinney, we know, is just seems to be viscerally opposed in a way that Nicola Sturgeon wasn't to the idea of a de facto referendum, and so he's come up with this what plan that I am rather dubious about trying to supposedly break the logjam on winning an independence referendum. So Labour Scotland seem to have accepted that the a de facto referendum is now off the agenda for the 2026 election, but they're not saying that John Swinney's plan cannot work. They are leaving open the possibility that uh, a good result for the SNP, I don't think they specify a majority, but a good result for the SNP could trigger a referendum by 2028, I think they've said. Perhaps the only point of distinction between what they're saying and what John Swinney is saying is that they sort of indicate that perhaps more than just an SNP win would require to bring this referendum about. Then they're talking about things like Plaid Cymru winning in Wales and Sinn Féin winning in Northern Ireland, which I think is in 2027 rather than next year. And the idea is this would build up a kind of sense of momentum that would make make progress towards either independence or to a referendum, well, much harder through this, certainly. So they're not excluding the possibility that John Swinney's plan will work. I mean, one of the things that Stu takes issue with is the idea that Plaid Cymru have a role to play in this, and he's absolutely incensed by the suggestion that Plaid Cymru are on course for victory at next year's Senedd election. He said, "Oh no, it's not the case at all that Plaid Cymru are in the lead in the polls." Well, let's be clear about this. In terms of YouGov polls, Plaid Cymru are very consistently in the lead. It's what we were seeing is a classic division in terms of different polling companies showing different things, different house effects producing different results. And YouGov arguably are more credible than the other polling companies that poll in Wales. And so the fact that YouGov are consistently showing Plaid in the lead, I think we should at least take some heed of. And it's similar to the point I've made about Scottish independence polling. We get very few polls from Ipsos, and they're kind of lost in among polls from other companies, which are much more numerous. But when polls from Ipsos do come along, they tend to show yes in the lead. They almost always show yes in the lead, at least in recent years. And we should be taking that a lot more seriously than we do because Ipsos have more of a pedigree than some of these other firms that are polling on independence. So the same is true in Wales with YouGov. But of course, what's really getting Stu's goat here is that he's gagging for Reform UK to win the Welsh election next year, and he can't cope with anybody suggesting that might not happen. Well, he's going to have to get used to the idea because in reality, even if Reform UK come out on top in terms of seats, there would still be probably a greater than 50% chance that Plaid Cymru would be the lead partner in any government that's formed because there's a much more natural route to Plaid Cymru forming a coalition, even from second place, than there is for Reform. I mean, Reform only really have one credible coalition partner, and that's the Tories, who are probably going to take a pounding. So there is unlikely to be a majority for Reform. So unless Labour sort of sit on their hands and allow Reform to form a minority government, and they would pay a hell of a price if they went down that road, I think it's highly likely actually that we're looking towards some sort of Plaid-led government, which is not what Stu wants to happen. And I must just note that in Stu's write-up of the Caerphilly by-election, he says something absolutely extraordinary. You know, it's a classic marker of London-centric attitudes that you can't think that anything that happens in Scotland or in Wales or that's Scotland-specific or Wales-specific has any value or relevance to human existence and that can only make sense within a sort of British context. And Stuart actually said that well, Plaid Cymru are not going to form the next UK government, so their victory in Caerphilly is irrelevant. So what's the real story here? He says. I mean, Plaid Cymru won a Welsh by-election. It was for the Senedd. It was a Senedd by-election. It was not a Westminster by-election. And that victory seems set to propel Plaid itself into government in Wales. So it ticks every box, and yet Stu's still saying, well, that doesn't matter. Tell me about Westminster. Spoken like the true British nationalist you have now become, Stuart. The other thing that Stuart said about Plaid is he's sort of disparaging the idea that this has any relevance towards the breakup of the United Kingdom, even if they do get into power, because they have said that they will not pursue an independence referendum within their first term of office, which is I'm not sure if it's going to be 4 or 5 years actually, but it's you know until 2030 or until 2031. They're saying that independence would be off the agenda in Wales, and they would just concentrate on putting domestic affairs in Wales right, and then the inference is they would then move on towards winning independence in a second term. And essentially, that just puts them in exactly the same position that the Alex Salmond-led government was in Scotland in 2007, where there was a unionist majority. There was no prospect of an independence referendum, and the SNP went through the motions of pursuing it, but it was obvious it wasn't going to happen within that 4-year term, and so they just built towards doing it in the second term, and they got that independence referendum in the second term, and that's pretty much the same sort of template that Plaid are following. So, in terms of momentum towards independence, I don't think there's much doubt that Plaid Cymru victory is certainly it's a blow for British unionism and in everybody's minds apart from Stuart's, it seems. So yeah, Believe in Scotland are saying that all this momentum from the Scottish election result if the SNP win and the Welsh election result if Plaid win and the Northern Ireland Assembly election if Sinn Féin emerges as largest party and Michelle O'Neill remains First Minister might produce an independence referendum, but they're also accepting it might not. And then they're saying we move on specifically to a de facto referendum 2029 for the Westminster election. And that's the point. That's why this is so encouraging. They're not saying, "Oh, we're just giving up on the referendum idea for next year, and then we pursue the referendum idea in 2029, and we'll then just put off the rejection of a referendum by a UK government at that point, and we just continue this endless cycle." No, they're saying that there has to be an end to this, and there has to be a move forward towards a de facto referendum, towards actually winning an outright mandate for independence at a scheduled election. Now, the point about this is that Believe in Scotland are very bravely, in my view, using the capital they have built up by going into this deal with the SNP. A lot of people have mocked that deal because they're saying that, well, the SNP and Believe in Scotland are indistinguishable anyway. They believe all the same things. There's no sort of controversy there. Well, John Swinney does not believe in a de facto referendum, and this is really significant pressure. For the first time, this is a sort of counterweight to the caution wing in the SNP, because where else is the pressure going to come from for John Swinney if he doesn't get his overall majority next year, or even if he does get his overall majority and a referendum is still rejected by London, where else is that pressure going to come from for him not to follow the normal sort of instincts of caution and to say, well, we tried our best, but the people of Scotland were not ready, and we have to listen to the people of Scotland. We have to forget about independence for a little while, and we have to go back to the bread and butter of governing to win that trust gradually, and then maybe in 5 years' time, in 2031, we can have another go at getting a single party overall majority, like 0.5% chance of that miracle happening. And then we'll ask for a referendum from Prime Minister Nigel Farage, perhaps, and we'll try our luck with old Nige. Completely hopeless. It's obviously far more sensible that at long last, we have to move on. If the referendum isn't an option, if you banged your head against the brick wall for the umpteenth time and it still hasn't worked, finally you have to make that decisive decision to move on to a more workable idea, to move on into what is inevitably going to be attempted eventually. And we're just wasting time until we get to that point. So this is really valuable pressure on the SNP government from a source that they cannot just dismiss because they've just gone into a deal with these people. Believe in Scotland have built up capital with SNP supporters. They have to be listened to. They built up, and by saying this, just by publishing this plan, they built up expectations which SNP supporters will take seriously. It's not coming from Alba. SNP loyalists are not going to reject this idea out of hand. It's not coming from the wild fringe or Liberate Scotland. This is coming from an SNP ally, and it's hard for John Swinney to ignore that if he doesn't get his overall majority next year. It's a really valuable counterweight, and it's not going to come from anywhere else. It's not going to come from Stephen Flynn's supporters because he is just as scathing about the de facto referendum idea that Nicola Sturgeon put forward as anybody else. The other supposed leadership contender is Mary McCallan. I don't know what her strategic views are, but I find it hard to believe she's very radical on strategy. So this is where the counterweight is coming from. And it's really, really valuable. And it may be a game changer that may actually help us to win independence a lot earlier than has seemed likely over the last few weeks. Because, if just say for the sake of argument, that John Swinney's plan is to just do the cautious thing and is to say, well, if we haven't got our overall majority, we tried our best, now we have to listen to the people and put independence on the back burner until 2031. Nigel Farage could well be in power by then. You have to think more realistically than that. And so you have to do it at the scheduled election in 2029. And of course, if you win that mandate, you might still be facing a Nigel Farage government, and you're then going to have to try and win independence in the face of that. But at least you've then got the outright mandate for independence, not the umpteenth mandate for a referendum, which can be so easily ignored because all of the others have been ignored, and that sets a precedent that would be certainly Nigel Farage would have no difficulty in following. You need something really strong to deal with the horrors of Nigel Farage in number 10 Downing Street, and an outright mandate for independence going into that Farage premiership is the absolute minimum if we're going to win independence in those circumstances. Anyway, that's it for now. If you're enjoying these videos, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. That would be really helpful because I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. And hey, Stu, what's the real story here?